Well, today the country awaits the fifth and final instalment of the state capture report following a delay which drew public criticism, prompting the presidency to issue a statement that there has been no interference with the commission or the work of the commission. Previous reports have mentioned individuals as well as SOEs, with the South African Airways and Transnet featuring large parts of the reports, and Transnet accounting for about 72% of the graft that took place between 2010 and 2018. Some of the names that have already been recommended by the State Capture Commission for prosecution for allegations of corruption and racketeering are former Minister of State Enterprises Malusi Gigaba, former Transnet CEO Brian Molefe, Siyabonga Gama, Transnet CFO Anoj Singh, amongst others. Those are just some of the names. So, Public Accountability Research Institute Executive Director Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi joins us virtually to help us reflect on what has happened so far after the evidence of the 4 reports that have already been released. Great to have you, Doc. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning, Leon. Good morning to your viewers.
Let me just ask you up front, if that fifth and final report is not handed over today and there is another delay, I mean, what do you think is going to be the reaction from people?
I think there's going to be the continuation of the uproar that we're already seeing. But also, I think there might even be attempts to go to court to challenge this, because there was an extension granted by the court. And that extension was until the 15th of June. Now, that has been missed. And so I think there might be grounds for some people to actually go to court to seek accountability.
All right, well, let's have a look at this. I mean, there have been many speculations about the final instalment of the report, and saying that it's expected to include findings on government entities like the SABC and the SSA, amongst others. So what are your expectations in this fifth report?
So I think, yes, indeed, we expect that there will be a lot on some of the SOEs that haven't been touched yet, or been touched in passing in the previous reports, including the SABC. But of course, the big one is the State Security Agency. But more than that, I think what this report needs to do, what we're expecting it to do, is to bring together everything that's been laid out in the first 4 reports. That is to say, what does this all amount to if we take all the 4 reports and the 5th report that'll deal with some of the SOEs, and what needs to happen? What needs to happen in terms of prosecutions? I mean, there have been recommendations, you've touched on some of them, but also there are bigger reforms that need to happen in how the state operates. There have been some recommendations, for example, on procurement reform in the country, but we expect more of that. What needs to happen? What is the big picture here? And what needs to happen in the country going forward to make sure that something like what we've seen doesn't happen again? So those are the big expectations from this particular report.
I mean, but the reality is that not much has actually happened since the first report was released. I mean, let's be honest. In terms of accountability, what should the country be seeing at this stage? What are we waiting for?
So we've seen some arrests, some beginnings of prosecutions from the National Prosecuting Authority. We've mentioned cases like Transnet, where people have now started appearing in court. The other big one, by the way, that we're expecting in this report is PRASA, where we've known for many years that there was also a massive graft going on. So one of the things that need to happen, of course, the follow through on the recommendations of the report. There are a lot of further investigations that have been recommended by the first 4 reports. Because the report, I mean, let's also remember this, the reports are very careful in not overstepping. So they're crafted very, very carefully. They present evidence, and they make recommendations to the South African Police Services, in some instances, to the NPA, to take forward some of those recommendations. But there are some places where they go far enough. I mean, the recommendations go far enough and recommend that certain people be prosecuted already. But again, still that is crafted quite carefully to indicate that there are grounds for prosecution. And it's left to the prosecuting authority to then make decisions on how to take that forward. So there are other processes that need to follow from what the recommendations that come out of these reports. And those authorities that are responsible for further investigation, for prosecution, are the ones that need to take that work forward. So we expect those authorities as well to do that work, to take the recommendations forward. And pressure is also mounting on the NPA, on the Hawks, on the SABC to take forward some of those recommendations.
Well, certainly. I mean, there's been a lot of money that's been put into these reports and a lot of time and energy, and South Africans have watched on. They've heard this evidence. They've heard of the stories that were relayed at that State Capture Commission and are still waiting. Now, I mean, the previous report stated that much wrongdoing during the state capture years is attributed to board members as well as company executives. But what about political heads who have allegedly been involved and have manipulated things from behind the scenes? I mean, Malusi, Gigaba and Lynn Brown were placed at the centre of things, but not many other names have come out yet.
So I think that's one of the biggest elephants in the room, so to speak, which is a lot of this can be put at the feet of political representatives in public life. There is a lot of political interference. We know that, and we know that it goes right down to municipalities, etc. And so one of the big things that we anticipate, and the Commission probed some of this, is that stronger recommendations on how to separate out politics from administration in our state. That's what has gone, one of the things that are at the center of this state capture project, and what has gone wrong in this country. And so we do expect that this final report is going to come up with strong recommendations about how to deal with the political administrative interface and how to roll back the very extensive political interference that we see that has led to state-owned enterprises, boards being handpicked in some instances by politicians, being picked in the headquarters of political parties. And that's one of the things that going forward in this country, we actually really need to roll back, because that's what has brought us to the mess that we see today. Mm-hmm. So I expect that the Commission is going to come up with some strong recommendations on that score.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there are no illusions that many will march themselves to the gallows, so to speak. I mean, there is certainly going to be a lot of resistance to avoid prosecution. Nobody wants to be behind bars. Nobody wants to be found guilty of these things, and will fight it tooth and nail. We can be assured of that. But do you hope that the country will eventually see some successful prosecutions from here on? And I'm talking big prosecutions.
I think from what we've begun to see the NPA do, that I've reason to hope that this is going to be followed through, and we are going to see some major prosecutions. Those prosecutions, as we know from what we've seen in other cases in the past, when we're dealing with people who have deep pockets, people who, in many instances, successfully looted state-owned companies in some instances, but also other parts of the state, and filled their coffers, they've got war chests, and they're going to fight, as you say. I mean, for years they're going to fight and draw out cases, and we're going to see cases within cases. So we have a long way to go. I think we need to have no illusions about that, to see people being convicted, people potentially being jailed. But I think more than that, I think what we also need to see is this work that's been done by the Commission having effects in public life, in political life, having an effect in how the state is organized and run. So I think prosecutions are one thing, and we need to maintain focus on that. But we also need to keep an eye over time on the kinds of reforms that take place, given impetus by the findings of the Commission. So, for example, there is a public procurement, a new bill that is before NEDLAC at present. I think the Commission's recommendations on public procurement add additional pressure to people who are working on that bill in National Treasury for that bill to be finalized. And we need to see follow through on those kinds of things. We need to see follow through on the way in which political parties fund themselves. Because I think part of the issue that we deal with here is that a lot of the funding that is siphoned out of the state is siphoned out to fund, in part, political parties because of the nature of political party funding in the country. There's a new public procurement bill. There's an act that was passed that has made the funding of political parties a little more transparent. But we continue to see some political parties not reporting to the IEC on their funding. So those kinds of things, I think further public pressure needs to be put on those things, and we need to watch them as they unfold so that we see these reports having effects beyond just prosecutions, but see into the organization of the state, into the management of the state.
Indeed. I mean, there are cases such as that of Gwede, who has already indicated that he will not resign, but he's going to take the state capture report on review. How much of that rebuttal is likely to actually take place? I mean, we've got this final one coming, and whether we like it or not, I mean, there's going to be a lot coming out today. I mean, we haven't even touched on Arthur Fraser. I have another interview coming up in the next hour, so we'll focus a little bit on Arthur Fraser. I'm just getting other aspects from you. But just taking these kind of things into consideration, what extent will it cause general delays in the prosecution process in this?
We expect that these cases are going to drag out for years and years, and in some cases, people will go to their graves, actually, with cases not having reached conclusion. We've seen this with other prosecutions that are actually ongoing already. The Estina Dairy Farm case, for example, where people are also, are bringing side issues to delay prosecution, or even trying to get the cases dismissed. So I think when we're dealing with people, as I mentioned earlier, who have the means to do so, we are going to see people fighting tooth and nail to actually not see the conclusion of their cases where cases have been lodged. But also, we're going to see people fighting tooth and nail to not get their cases in court. So I think we should anticipate that this is going to go on for years and years on the prosecution front. That people are going to, that people are going to use whatever means they have, and they're going to throw everything at the state, at the NPA, even when it comes to some of the further investigations that have been recommended. There's going to be obstruction of those investigations. That I think we can expect. There's no two ways about it.
No two ways about it. You're right. Just finally, as I wrap up, I mean, in one of the reports, it basically goes on to say that Transnet was involved in major procurements of locomotives, network services, and infrastructure expansion, with serious acts of PFMA contraventions on an unjustifiable deal of over 9 billion rand for the procurement of, I think it's 1,064 locomotives. But the language used so far in these reports is that law enforcement agencies should conduct further investigations with a view of possible prosecutions. I mean, some have questioned why such wording, with all the time spent on gathering evidence leading to the findings of the commission, and also, that work that we were saying, that there's, the link up between the MPA and what the findings are at the commission. The wording is, I suppose, very open at this in the reports.
So I think we have unrealistic expectations sometimes of what a commission of inquiry can do, because the terms of reference of a commission, or this particular commission, are also crafted in such a way that it would be overstepping if the commission went further than that. The work that the commission itself has done has been hampered by some people who've refused to appear before it. And so it has some evidence, but it may not have strong enough evidence in some instances that can lead to successful prosecutions. And so it needs to hand over what it has. It needs to pass the baton, so to speak, to agencies that have a direct mandate to take that work forward, to do further investigation, to find the evidence that can then stand up in a court of law. So I think that's really what the commission had to deal with, that it does not have the legs to stand on in some instances in going further on those recommendations, and it needs to be careful enough that it stops somewhere where it can make strong enough recommendations to other agencies, and that those agencies have the space to take forward the work that is handed over to them.
All right, we leave it there. Thank you. Thanks so much for talking to us. Public Accountability Research Institute Executive Director, Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi, talking to us ahead of the fifth and final state capture report expected to be released later on today. We'll be talking about that again in the next hour in our interviews, so stay tuned. A lot more to come on that top story about. Let's get